Hey everyone, I'm Nick Henderson from 4playernetwork.com and host of 4Player Podcast, and these are my top 10 games of 2020. Full disclosure, this was my number 11 up until about 30 minutes ago when I decided to change it. But I'm going to start this year with Final Fantasy VII Remake, or perhaps I should call it Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1. It's hard to believe this game actually exists, as I was convinced it was most certainly vaporware. But not only does it exist, it's remarkably competent. Admittedly, an odd descriptor for a remake of one of the most beloved JRPGs of all time. The reasons this game almost missed my list are numerous. Side quests in this game, for the most part, are terrible. A lot of the level design is remarkably linear, and some of the liberties taken with the story are borderline Kingdom Hearts levels of absurd. But, despite all that, this game taps into that deep-rooted nostalgia in a way that doesn't feel cheap or empty. It translates a lot of the systems from the original into modern interpretations that are deep and rewarding, and on the surface level, it's a glorious recreation of a world I never thought I'd visit again, in any meaningful way anyways. And what I find most surprising is that it manages to straddle the line between clear-cut remake and spiritual successor. It follows the events that take place within the walls of Midgar in the opening hours of the original game, while somehow adding enough additional content to effectively fill out a full 30-plus hour game. Characters that were originally mere side notes to Cloud's story have been fully realized and now feel like real, developed characters. In particular, Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse. Sephiroth, who originally didn't really become a major component of the story until after leaving Midgar, now slips into the role of villain much earlier, haunting Cloud through a series of disturbing visions until he finally reveals himself in epic fashion. And most importantly, the main cast feels more alive than ever before and somehow miraculously avoids the fate of their Advent Children era counterparts. Gone is the self-serious bravado that defined every spin-off that tried to capitalize on the success of the PS1 Classic. They are likable again. All of the nuance that was once communicated through written dialogue and stilted animation is now fully voiced and fully realized, and it's beautiful. It has the magic that has been missing from this generation of Final Fantasy. Take a stroll through the slums, visit Aerith's home, take on the Dawn and Wall Market, you'll see what I mean. The combat system has also been fully redesigned to fit more in line with the action RPG feel of modern Final Fantasy, complete with a reimagined materia system. It's fast-paced, and when I eventually got the hang of quickly switching between and queuing up moves for 3 active characters in real time, I felt skilled and empowered. I especially love how you can actually see the materia slotted into your equipment even when running around the world. At the end of the day, it's not perfect, and it ultimately ensures that this remake will take years to fully come to fruition, but what they accomplished with this first part is nothing short of reassuring. It set the stage for a wildly different interpretation of this classic story in future parts, while also delivering the purest and most respectable entry in the beloved franchise since the PS2 era, and that is something we should all be very happy about. Truth be told, when I started playing Tell Me Why, I didn't expect it to really hold my attention long enough for me to finish it. I was never the biggest fan of Life is Strange, even if I did appreciate Don't Nod's spin on that classic Telltale formula. Their signature look, while not as immediately sound as Telltale's, is clean, pretty to look at, and considerably more technically sound. I was just waiting for them to combine that with an original story that would prove they were also equally talented storytellers. Well, I think Tell Me Why might be the game that I've been waiting for. Knowing what I knew about the game, and also being very self-aware of my own ignorance on trans issues, I wasn't sure if this game would be a trip worth taking for me. In 2020, it has never been more obvious that putting stock in the wrong person or thing in an effort to learn more about an issue can be just as dangerous or unproductive as the ignorance itself. I actually reached out to the trans community on Twitter to ask their reactions to the game, and was pleased to hear that for the most part, it seems like the issues at the heart of Tell Me Why are handled with care. which is great because looking back at it, it's a game I'm so glad that I was able to play, and it's one I think a lot of people could benefit from. The game takes place in Alaska and tells the story of Tyler and Allison, two close siblings who, after experiencing a traumatic incident as children, are separated for the remainder of their adolescence. After transitioning and spending years in a juvenile detention center, Tyler is reunited with his sister as they return to their hometown, rekindle their relationship, and prepare to sell their childhood home. As one might expect, old ghosts come back to haunt them, and they start to learn more about the event that changed their lives as children. It's a fairly straightforward skeleton of a story, but one that works remarkably well thanks to some solid performances, likable characters, and an intriguing mystery at its core. If I had to identify one common theme between Don't Nod games, it seems to be their interest in injecting some minor element of the supernatural into their otherwise grounded stories. And tell me why, Tyler and Allison have a literal mental bond that allows them to communicate telepathically or share emotions. It sounds silly, and it honestly kind of is, but it opens the door for some interesting character development and provides the foundation for the game's main mechanical feature. Throughout its 3-episode structure, you switch between these two siblings and explore the environments as the story unfolds. The main draw of exploration is finding forgotten memories, which unlocks dialogue, creates branching paths, and unveils additional clues that add a welcomed layer to the story. It's a simple game that works. Like Life is Strange, it makes good use of music to create a mood, and it doesn't get too bogged down in mechanical complexity. Instead, it lets the story do the heavy lifting. It shines a light on some very important progressive issues in a welcoming way, while highlighting the importance of acceptance in 2020. It may actually be the most socially important game of the year, but it's also just a gripping story that makes it an easy recommendation to everyone. It has somehow been both an amazing year and a shockingly slow year for VR, yet The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners remains one of the most satisfying games of the year. If you already own a VR headset, you might be forgiven for letting this one pass you by. After all, it does sport the Walking Dead name, which has lost some of its shine in recent years. But don't let the license fool you. This game is one of the most immersive, mechanics-driven games of the entire year. I don't think it will take home any storytelling awards as it opts for a simple and somewhat empty narrative setup. Telltale's The Walking Dead, this is not, but it does drop you into an immersive interpretation of the streets of New Orleans and put you on a path to finding the Reserve, quote-unquote, a rumored military bunker that is filled with survival supplies. It's your job to scout the surrounding area to find clues while evading or otherwise dealing with zombies and warring human factions. Exploring and collecting items allows you to return to your hub camp and craft additional resources and unlock new abilities that help you out in the world. It's not truly open, I guess, but each area is fully explorable as you see fit. You can choose your own path, find shortcuts, cut through buildings, climb pipes, etc. There really is nothing like slowly creeping through an abandoned building and not knowing what awaits you around every corner. But you also got to keep your eye on your watch, because at specific intervals, someone rings the bells at the center of town and stirs up the horde, making it much more perilous to travel through the streets. But what makes this game so memorable is how it encourages smart use of your surroundings to survive. It's in moments of desperation when I had to improvise that I truly fell in love with this game, like when I had to break through a boarded-up window using just the butt of my empty rifle to evade approaching zombies. For all intents and purposes, this is a survival horror game at its core. Ammunition is scarce, so every shot fired counts. In fact, it's so scarce that most of the combat in the game is melee-focused. If you ever watched the show and thought to yourself, wow, these people are fucking crazy for getting so close to zombies to take them out, this game forces you to make the same kinds of decisions and take the same kinds of risks in the interest of survival. Melee is sometimes necessary to preserve ammo, and other times, you simply don't want to make noise and draw the attention of other enemies. Either way, you better get comfortable with close encounters quickly. And to further complicate matters, melee weapons will often get stuck inside enemy skulls and have to be forcefully yanked out before you can turn your attention elsewhere. I was once forced to use a gun with my right hand because I couldn't pull the machete in my left hand from the zombie's head. It's fucking brutal. At the end of the day, this is a game that makes clever use of its license to influence the overall design. It's one of the purest Walking Dead experiences available, and it's another unforgettable example of why VR has a future, even if it is a little slow getting off the ground. Ghost of Tsushima is possibly the biggest example of the impact graphics can have on an experience. Under the hood, this is a very easy game to understand because, without any real attempt at misdirection, it imitates countless other open-world games that have come out in the past 10 years. But it does so while looking fucking insanely beautiful. Don't get me wrong though, I don't mean to sell it short. This game is noteworthy as well from a gameplay standpoint, and certainly from a storytelling standpoint as well, but we'll get there in a second. Because, Jesus, this game is beautiful. Not just on a purely visual level, but also through respect for the culture and the way it lets the scenery literally breathe. And while I've played games with better quote-unquote living worlds, Red Dead Redemption 2 comes to mind, few games have captured movement in nature as naturally as Ghost of Tsushima. Wind touches and impacts everything on the island. Grass sways in the wind, it carries leaves as they fall from the trees, it changes direction on a whim and shifts the whole landscape with it. All the while, it guides the player with smart use of color and in-world distractions. It really made exploring every nook and cranny of the island a joy. Quests and side quests alike stuck pretty close to the typical guided nature of most open-world games, but the design flourishes all around them more than made up for the few shortcomings. Combat also felt like it was crafted with the same level of care and attention to detail. It's responsive, versatile, and surprisingly demanding, especially when engaging in one-on-one duels with skilled samurai. The way that it demands patience of the player felt so thematically appropriate as well. When you further consider just how well constructed the skill trees are, it's not surprising that the game's strengths are able to overshadow that nagging feeling of familiarity. But did I mention this game is just absolutely stunning to look at? And the animation and sound effects that went into Jin swiping the blood off his sword and then resheathing never get old. But I think what really kept this game from feeling rote was the story it told and the way it told it. What starts as a simple quest to rid the island of foreign invaders quickly turned into a more personal story about Jin Sakai's inner turmoil. Can he turn his back on everything he was taught and embrace dishonorable tactics to save his island and his people, even if it means betraying his culture and the very people he aims to protect? It was an enthralling conflict that built to a satisfying ending that felt more than earned. But look, Ghost of Tsushima is not a perfect game, not by a long shot. But like so many new IPs this generation, even just within the PlayStation ecosystem, it has so much potential. Sucker Punch tapped into something truly special with this game, and it's one I'm eager to see continued in the inevitable sequel. If it had pushed just a little harder and taken a few more risks, this absolutely could have been a shoo-in for Game of the Year. But with that said, it is absolutely worth the money and time invested if you decide to take the plunge. If you need more motivation, just fucking look at it, man. Seriously, holy crap. This game looks amazing. Like, really damn good. The latest addition to this list is one that I'm so glad I made time for. The PlayStation 5 had a strong launch in late 2020, but Bluepoint's remake of Demon's Souls is undoubtedly the strongest exclusive on the platform at launch. It's a game that doesn't need much of an introduction other than to say it's an absolutely beautiful recreation of the game that gave birth to the Dark Souls series. It's also the only Souls game I've never finished, and against all odds, I think this manages to be the ideal version to play. It plays like a dream, and much like Ghost of Tsushima, it's incredibly beautiful. This one-to-one remake of Demon's Souls is by far the biggest demonstration of the power behind the PlayStation 5 in the infancy of its lifetime. The lighting and particle effects alone, especially when in the comfort of the Nexus, makes it a major contender for being one of the most beautiful games I've ever played. Of course, though, I'm not here to just gush over how good games look in the year 2020. Demon's Souls stands as one of the most unique spins on the Souls formula that a lot of people, of course, associate with Dark Souls. But before Dark Souls catapulted this franchise into the mainstream spotlight, Demon's Souls did it a little different, and I've gotta say, I really like it. For instance, the way the worlds or regions are accessed through archstones in the Nexus is probably my second favorite approach to world design in the series, just shy of the original Dark Souls. Rather than following a linear path or exploring a wide open map, it's about hopping between the different worlds and chipping away at them gradually. Bonfires, quote-unquote, mark the spot of fallen bosses, so you shouldn't expect to find a safe haven around every turn. You have to make legitimate progress in order to permanently push forward into a level. It serves up a hell of a challenge at times, but just like all Souls games, that shot of serotonin you get when you topple a boss just can't be beat. Hit a wall or feel overwhelmed? Hop into a different archstone for a while and see what you can achieve. There are, of course, a few spots where I feel the game is inferior to Dark Souls, such as its reliance on expendable items over the Estus Flask, but that hasn't really detracted from my enjoyment in the slightest, because almost every aspect of the game is utterly addicting. Admittedly, Bluepoint's contributions, minus a few quality of life improvements maybe, seem almost entirely superficial. Regardless, that new coat of paint brings this cult classic roaring into the modern era in a big way. Some might take issue with some of the visual redesigns of some of the enemies, characters, and bosses, but as someone who went in mostly blind, I found their interpretations to be every bit as beautiful and satisfying as any From Software Souls game. You know, I have a feeling there are a lot of people out there like myself who have jumped on every Souls game they come across, but was maybe reluctant to go back to the original Demon Souls. If that sounds like you, make this game a priority. It's the perfect way to go back and experience an important piece of Dark Souls history. With the bittersweet success of PT still lingering and the reemergence of Silent Hill as a major franchise looking less and less likely, the existence of Visage is especially significant. Make no mistake, this indie horror game is not only a love letter to what PT could have been, it also forges its own identity and runs with it to great effect. It takes the promise of PT and extrapolates it out into a full 12 to 15 hour game, and it was without question one of the best games I played all year. For those of you who may have dabbled in the game during its run in early access, it was probably pretty clear that the game was riffing on the success of PT, even if it was difficult to imagine how far they could really take that concept. In the opening moments, the player character commits a horrific murder-suicide before awaking in a room that bears a striking resemblance to the starting room in PT. When you leave that room, though, you find yourself in a quiet, photorealistic house on a rainy night. From there, you just explore the maze-like house to find clues and objects that eventually trigger major story chapters, each one delving into the story of a character who lived and died in the house. Between chapters, it doesn't hold your hand or point you in any specific direction other than to occasionally fuck with your head. Lights may flicker or go out entirely, doors might slam closed, you might hear knocking or scratching noises in the walls. Hauntings deplete your sanity, but those effects can be temporarily repelled with rare candles that can be placed throughout the house. But once one of those main chapters is triggered, the real fun begins. This game is without question one of the scariest games I've ever played, by a considerable margin. But more importantly, it succeeds through sheer variety of experience. In one chapter, you are relentlessly stalked by a quote-unquote ring ghost who fucks with you by removing all of the light switches in the house, forcing you to navigate using just the instant flashes of an old camera. An opportunity, I assure you, they do not waste. In another, you are scouring the house for mirrors that serve as portals into other dimensions, giving you the briefest glimpse of the outside world. On top of that, it frequently asks you to do the unthinkable. One of my favorite moments of the entire year was realizing that my only path forward would require me to snuff out my only light source and then walk blindly towards a ghostly figure blocking my path in the dark. And that's just one example. There are so many ingenious moments and challenges in this game that I would hate to spoil, and it's such a rewarding game because of the trust it puts in the player to figure things out for themselves. It stumbles a little thanks to a perplexing inventory system, but that was easily eclipsed by the game's incredible audiovisual presentation and puzzle design. It evokes a feeling I'll often compare to some of my favorite horror games of the past decade, like Alien Isolation or Resident Evil 7. It may not be the return to Silent Hill that some of us have been waiting for, but it's a brilliant reminder that there are plenty of exciting horror games ready and willing to fill that void. The Western is somewhat of a rare genre in video games for some reason, I don't know. Red Dead Redemption, my favorite game of all time, being the obvious genre lead. There have been some gems here and there, games like Call of Juarez, Gunslinger in particular, but for the most part, the few games that do dabble rarely nail the landing. Desperados 3 sports a brand name I honestly never knew existed, and embraces a gameplay genre that I usually bounce off of pretty quick. Yet here I am, absolutely in love with this beautiful blend of Western story tropes and real-time tactics gameplay. Now, I realize that the word tropes may imply predictability or sloppy writing, but in this case, I think they elevate the game thanks to its undeniable charm, clever scenarios, and confidence of execution. The game focuses on the personal vendetta between main character John Cooper and mustache-twirling villain Frank, the leader of a vicious gang of outlaws that murdered John's father when he was a child. As an adult and skilled gunslinger, Cooper is on a mission through the South in the 1870s to avenge his father's death. Along the way, he runs into a collection of colorful characters who join him on his mission, each providing their own brilliant hook or mechanic that broadens the scope of the gameplay considerably. Hector is a brute who is capable of setting bear traps. McCoy can snipe and heal. Kate is capable of stealing disguises and distracting enemies with their good looks and charm, etc., etc. And all of these characters deliver excellent banter together as you play out these beautiful, challenging, and diverse missions. But experimentation is the name of the game. It's critical to the loop, and it's incredibly rewarding thanks to the quick save system and instantaneous reloads. It's all about finding the many different ways to have these characters cooperate and coordinate. Each level is massive and full of unique scenarios and challenges designed to impede your progress. I hate to fall back on comparisons again, but this game really is the best of both Hitman and Trials HD. Trying to pull off complex maneuvers or combat scenarios while at the mercy of tactics rules is relentlessly addicting. The fact that you can set up each character's actions in layers and then execute them all simultaneously led to some of the most satisfying and rewarding moments of the entire year, no question. For example, I may end up in a situation where I ask myself, can I set it up so that Kate distracts these two guards while Cooper and Hector team up to toss a knife and hatchet into their backs? If so, can I then drag their bodies into these adjacent bushes before the next patrolling guard comes around that corner? Most of the time, I have no idea, but I'm sure as hell gonna try. And when you do pull it off, it's fucking magic. And some of these encounters, from a design standpoint, are absolutely devious. But all of these complexities work because the visual language of the game is just brilliant. It communicates everything you need to make educated decisions but leaves just enough ambiguity that it's nearly impossible to truly anticipate all of the ripple effects of your actions, making every choice you make an absolute nail-biter. Look, in any other year, this would be a shoo-in for my number one spot. It should say a lot about the next 3 games I'm going to discuss because this game is nothing short of brilliant. It's one of the tightest and most brutally challenging games I've played all year, but believe me, the game rewards players who see it through to the end. But let me just wrap up by saying, as someone who holds Red Dead Redemption 2 in the highest regard, it's my favorite game of all time, I consider this to be the next best Western game I've ever played. Not only did 2020 bring Half-Life as a franchise back to life in the most unexpected way, it did so while also providing an incredibly satisfying answer to those of us who have been agonizing over the cliffhanger ending of Half-Life 2 Episode 2 for the past decade. Let me be clear, Half-Life Alyx is not just some VR tech demo that cashes in on a popular brand name. It's a fully realized, masterfully executed return to a long-dormant franchise. But it's also, without question, the new poster child for VR as a platform. I've put quite a few VR games on these lists in the past, but this is by far the cleanest, most tactile VR game I've ever played. It's almost completely void of VR jank, quote-unquote. Animations are silky smooth, and the decision to use free-floating hands without actual arms mean that I was never distracted by awkward attempts to display parts of my own body that weren't critical for gameplay purposes. In fact, there was very little from the visual presentation to distract me at all or take me out of the experience. It even takes something as simple as reloading your gun and makes it feel tactile in a way that I've never experienced. Each gun is handled and operated differently, so it's up to you to eject the magazine, chamber a round, or manually switch the firing mode using intuitive hand movements. Long story short, when I was playing this game, I was in it. On the surface, Half-Life Alyx seems like a fairly straightforward VR first-person shooter, albeit a far more polished game than most on a superficial level. But when you look closer, it does so much more than polish up an existing formula. It completely reinvents the way you, as the player, interact with objects in the world, not only from a technical standpoint, but also in terms of the lore. Using a set of gravity gloves developed by Russell, Alyx is able to pull nearby objects into her hand with a simple flick of her wrist. It sounds simple, but its impact cannot be understated. You can pull ammo from hard-to-reach places, catch grenades in midair, and so much more. In fact, it is easily the driving force of much of the game's overall level design, which is incredible, by the way. And when you couple that with the freedom of movement and physics-based puzzle solving, it's pure bliss. But to circle back around for a moment to Half-Life as a beloved franchise, I never would have guessed that this reemergence would serve to expand the universe in meaningful ways, but it absolutely does. It's packed with incredible set pieces, thrilling firefights, smart puzzle design, and a cast of characters and creatures that are every bit as vibrant as they were when Half-Life 2 was king. From witnessing the Combine-occupied streets of City 17, to playing a horrifying game of cat and mouse with a freak named Jeff, to pushing through an abandoned zoo swarming with antlions, this game is a Half-Life fan's wet dream, and it all culminates in a shocking reveal that paves the way for an insanely satisfying ending, one that certainly implies that Half-Life still very much has a future. Honestly, it's hard to believe this is only my number 3 choice, but it's very much been that kind of year. It's a shame that the game is somewhat inaccessible due to VR exclusivity, but make no mistake, this is the game that fans deserved, and for the first time in over a decade, I think we can safely say that Half-Life is back. Okay, historically speaking, I have bounced off of every roguelike I've ever tried. Call me crazy, but I'm just not into the idea of replaying the same levels over and over again, even if there is a satisfying progression system to reward my efforts. It's just not a genre that appeals to me, and despite numerous attempts, no game has ever changed my perception. But Hades is a remarkable exception to that rule. It embraces every aspect of the genre that I dislike, but polishes it until it becomes something unrecognizable. It recontextualizes everything, and now it is bordering on being my favorite game of 2020. A lot of roguelikes find clever ways to apply story context to the repetition, but Hades has by far the most ingenious concept to date, and on top of that, it provides an overwhelming number of characters, motivations, and flourishes that are enough to make even the staunchest opposition forget they are playing a roguelike. As Zagreus, the son of Hades, you are trying to fight your way out of the depths of hell in an effort to find the truth about what happened to your mother. Of course, this is easier said than done, and every time you fall in battle, you emerge from the bloody pool back in the Hall of Hades. Between each run, you can strike up conversations with the inhabitants, unlock new stat upgrades, etc. It sounds straightforward, I know, but every time you return, things change slightly. Characters may move around or be missing entirely, new dialogue is unlocked, and relationships are progressed. And despite having an absurdly accessible and fun combat system, it's the social dynamics that kept me coming back for more than 50 hours. I was obsessed with running around after each run, seeing what each character was up to, and seeing what I could do to push their story forward. Whether it's bickering with Hades himself, talking to Achilles about his heroics prior to his death, or of course, slowly whittling away at the contemptuous relationship between Zagreus and Megara until all that remained was love and respect. It's all expertly paced and performed, and I couldn't get enough of it. But of course, combat and progression is the name of the game with any roguelike, and Hades packs in so many layers of depth that it never seems to get old. In each run, you choose a weapon, which can be upgraded and fundamentally changed. Then, once you're in the run, each room rewards you with randomized boons that are awarded by one of the many gods that are looking out for you from Mount Olympus. Boons might include chain lightning from Zeus, or increased movement speed from Hermes, just to name a few. But it's the various combinations of these boons with special trinkets and incremental stat increases that make each run in Hades feel unique, and your success depends greatly on choosing boons that accentuate or play off each other. And on top of all that, the gods and bosses that you run into throughout each run introduce their own set of twists and opportunities for social advancement. And when you finally reach the final level and topple the final boss, a whole other story dynamic is introduced. Everything is once again recontextualized, and the game continues. Even after credits eventually roll, there are still dozens of hours of game left to play, dialogue to hear, and relationships to develop. I really just can't stress this enough. Hades is a masterpiece, and it's a game that transcends its own genre label. There is nothing that should stop anyone from trying this game because not only is this Supergiant's best game to date, it is without question a genre-defining game. It's kind of like the impact Dark Souls had, in that the common sentiment now becomes, we live in a post-Hades world, when talking about what it means to be a roguelike. I don't know if this means I'm suddenly open to playing more roguelikes, but I can assure you, if any game in the future draws comparisons to Hades, it has my attention.
You had it coming.
Over the past decade, games have become increasingly cinematic, largely in part to the tremendous success and technical achievements of studios like Naughty Dog. One of my fondest memories of attending E3 was the debut of Uncharted 2 back in 2009. I just could not believe what I was seeing. However, achieving this level of cinematic flair often comes at a price. Gameplay or mechanics often feel constrained for the sake of keeping tight control over what we are seeing or experiencing at all times. In 2020, Naughty Dog circumvented this trade-off gracefully with The Last of Us Part 2, making it, without question, my favorite game of the year by a considerable margin. For some, this may be a controversial choice. It was certainly a divisive game. Many took issue with the story they opted to tell, or the fate of the characters they had grown to love in that first game, and I can see why, even if I wholeheartedly disagree. It's an unapologetically dark story that reminds us that nobody is exempt from the cruelty of life. It drives home the age-old idea that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, and while some claim that to be too basic of a theme for something as prestigious as The Last of Us, I found it to be the perfect way to continue the story of Joel and Ellie by dealing head-on with the violent ripple effect of Joel's dramatic decision at the end of the first game. The team at Naughty Dog picked up that narrative thread and followed it to its likely conclusion. But the story at the heart of The Last of Us 2 was so powerful to me because of the restraint they showed in pacing the story and the new characters they introduced that essentially expanded the universe. It's no longer just a story about Joel and Ellie. Its world is much bigger than that now, and I was left craving a sequel this time around rather than dreading it like I was the first time. At the end of the day, I was every bit as invested in Ellie's romantic relationship with Dina, Lev's escape from the Seraphite cult, and of course, Abby's journey of redemption. In fact, any one of these characters could serve as the basis for future Last of Us games. But to return back to my original point for a second, Naughty Dog accomplished all of this while also crafting a game that feels wholly unrestrained by its cinematic design. Environments are huge and fun to explore, but this freedom of mobility is never more apparent than when engaged in combat. The word that frequently gets tossed around on our own podcast is scrappy. The scrappy nature of combat means that every mistake you make doesn't hinder the experience, it elevates it. Ellie is fighting for her life with every ounce of her being during these firefights, and that desperation just adds to the cinematic quality. Being able to run, dive, smash windows, vault over obstacles, scamper up walls, just creates this incredible sense of physicality and freedom in combat. Furthermore, AI partners are not only useful, but fully capable of coming to your rescue or serving as a valuable distraction. They serve a valuable purpose in gameplay, and again, add to that sense that you are pulling the strings in a big-budget Oscar-bait film. But what sticks out to me the most is how beautifully crafted the narrative structure is. And while the scope of the project ultimately led to some unfortunate industry no-nos, the game they delivered is over twice as large as the original game and shockingly diverse to boot. It's a triumph of world, combat, and narrative design. There's no such thing as a wasted or uninteresting level or sequence in this game. They took full advantage of the Seattle setting to create the most jaw-droppingly gorgeous, rain-soaked environments. It's quite honestly the most beautiful, most authentic feeling post-apocalypse I've ever seen. And despite telling two concurrent stories taking place in the same city at the same time, it's absurd how little is actually reused over the course of this 30-plus hour game. And woven throughout this huge, diverse game are unforgettable set pieces, moments of quiet exploration, sequences of intense horror and action, and it's all held together with the best performances this industry has to offer, period. The Last of Us Part 2 became an instant classic for me. It was one of my favorite launches ever. It dominated a 4-day weekend back in June, and it took me on the most satisfying narrative journey I can remember, and while also delivering the most unrestrained, satisfying gameplay in the genre. I cried multiple times throughout this game. I was an emotional wreck when the credits finally rolled. I haven't stopped thinking about it, and I suspect that I won't anytime soon. It's projects like this that remind me of the power of video games. It reminds me that they can be much more than just entertainment. They can make you feel, they can make you think, and they can have a lasting impact on the people that play them. And that's worth celebrating. So, with that in mind, bravo Naughty Dog. For me, The Last of Us Part 2 is the best game of 2020, but it's also so much more than that. It's an important cultural touchpoint that raised the bar higher than I ever thought possible, and it will most certainly help shape the way I examine games in the years to come. And there it is. 2020 may have been a dumpster fire in a lot of ways, but it certainly delivered some incredible games. I hope you'll join us again in 2021 to talk all things gaming on 4playernetwork.com. In the meantime, stay safe and be kind. Cheers.